When we're thinking about the kind of writing Revelation is, the genre, one of the things we noticed was that it claims to be a letter. John is writing to particular people at a particular time in a particular place. And actually, interestingly, one of the things that commentators all agree about is that whatever else he is, John is a consummate pastor. He's writing to people that he knows, and he's writing to a situation which he knows and he understands, even though he himself is actually at some distance on the Isle of Patmos. Well, if he's writing to a particular time and place, what do we know about their situation? And one of the debates around the whole book of Revelation is the actual date it was written. And there are two main theories about that. One, it was written in the 60s under the time of Nero as the Roman emperor, when there was a century of the first really serious persecution of Christians across the empire, although the evidence for that is a little bit mixed. The other main theory, it was about 30 years later in the 90s, so right at the end of John, if this is John the Apostle who's writing, right at the very end of his life, under the reign of the Emperor Domitian. I'm not sure it makes that much difference which date we plumb for. And actually, if you hear someone saying, oh, well, I know the exact year and the exact circumstances, and that explains exact features of the book, and actually you need to take it with a pinch of salt, because what people often do is they look at the text of Revelation, they infer from that the situation that there is going on, then they locate that in a particular date, then they go, ha, look how the text speaks so cleverly to that situation. Well, as you can see, that's an entirely circular argument. But it certainly appears as though there was some kind of pressure, of challenge to the Christians. The real question is, was it really persecution? One of the things that's quite challenging as you read through chapters 2 and 3 is to say, well, you know, if I was a pastor and I was writing to Christians who were really facing a challenge to their faith, they were facing persecution, what would I say? I think by and large I'd be pretty positive, and I'd say, you know, you're doing great, keep on, don't worry, Jesus is with you. Actually, you read the letters and they're rather sobering. Quite a lot of the time John's saying, or the risen Jesus is saying through John, do you know what? You're not doing great. You need to shape up. You haven't realised how serious your situation is. So there's an interesting question to say, is this really comfort to those who are challenged, or is it really a challenge to those who are comfortable, who are too compromised with their culture? Maybe that's one of the things we need to take away as 21st century readers. Have we realised that the challenge that we're really facing, and have we sat up and taken notice? So whatever the exact date, one of the things we do need to do is take seriously the situation. And the classic example is in the 7th of these messages to the church in Laodicea. And it's a verse people know really well. It's in chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, where the risen Jesus says, I know your works. I know that you are neither hot nor cold, but you are lukewarm. And because you're lukewarm, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. It's pretty graphic imagery, really. What he's saying is the Laodiceans to Jesus, they make him sick. Now the question is, what does that mean? And usually I say to people, well, what do you think it means to be hot? And most people say, well, it's about being passionate in your faith. It's about being on fire for Jesus. And they use those kind of images and metaphors. And I say to them, well, what does it mean to be cold? And they say, well, it means to be uninterested. It means to be indifferent. It means to be, you know, unbelieving. And I say, well, okay, in that case, if hot means passionate for your faith and cold means indifferent, what does it mean to be lukewarm? And then, of course, the answer is, well, it means they're Anglican. Or, well, if they're being polite, they say it means they're a bit in the middle there. So they're neither one nor the other, but somewhere in between. They're kind of, you know, middle-of-the-road Christians. They're not completely indifferent, but they're not passionate. Now, when we read it like that, we're reading entirely out of our own experience. When we read the text, we actually hear the risen Jesus saying, would that you were hot or cold rather than lukewarm. Is it really the case Jesus would prefer we were completely indifferent to things of faith than that we were muddling along somewhere in the middle? I really doubt that. Apart from anything else, most of us have gone through our lives and gone through that sort of middle of the road patch. It doesn't really make sense. And actually, it couldn't have been what the Christians in Laodicea would have understood. We just need to think about their own situation. Laodicea actually sits halfway up a hillside above the valley of the river Lycus. And across the other side of the river is a place we now call Pamukkale. It was called Hierapolis in the 1st century. And that was a spa town. That had hot water coming out of the mountainside, and it made its money by people coming there on holiday and taking the waters for therapy, for healing, and it became a religious centre as a result. If you went further up the Lycus Valley, you got to a town that you'll have heard of called Colossi, and Colossi was well known for having cold springs, and this is all in the west end of what we now call Turkey. And if you've been there on holiday, it's pretty hot in the summer, and you want cold water. It's very refreshing. So hot water is good for something. It's good for healing, good for therapy. Cold water is good for something. What the Laodiceans had was neither. Their springs were halfway up the mountain, and it had to come down piped to them. They had hot springs, but by the time the water got to them, it was neither hot nor was it cold, it was lukewarm. And if you've ever picked up an old cup of tea and drank it by mistake, you'll know that lukewarm water makes you, well, it can make you feel sick, makes you want to spew it out of your mouth. And the water had actually dissolved the calcium in the rock, and so you got the equivalent of kettle fur in the bottom. That's what Jesus is saying. He's not saying you're middle of the road wishy-washy Anglicans, that's no good. What he's saying is, it's not a measure of your faith, it's a measure of what he says, I know your works. He's not saying these people are muddling along in the middle. What he's saying is you're neither hot, good for one thing, nor cold, good for something else. You're actually good for nothing. You may have the greatest ever charismatic praise up. You may exercise the gifts of the Spirit. You may speak in tongues. But when you leave your service, you're not actually making a difference in the world around you. The grace you've received in God isn't being conveyed to others as grace which is effective in their lives. And that's just one example of saying, if we know a little bit about the context that these first Christians are in, that John's writing to, it makes a huge difference in the way we read it, and it really brings it alive. Just looking at the other messages as well, to the church in Smyrna, Christ describes himself as the one who was dead and came to life. And actually Smyrna knew exactly what that meant as a city. It had died, it had been destroyed not once but twice, and been refounded and come back to life. The language he uses, the promise at the end, is to the one who conquers in Smyrna, I will give the crown of life. Smyrna was known as the crown of Asia. It ran its own games. It had a crown on the coin. It knew this symbolism and it knew this imagery, and it told them that Jesus knew all about them and about their situation. Pergamum, to the one who conquers in Pergamum, I'll give a white stone with a new name on. Actually, the local stone in Pergamum was black basalt, and if you wanted to inscribe your name on a building, you had to import white limestone, otherwise the name wasn't readable. They knew all the difference between black stone and white limestone. And the church in Sardis is told to wake up and strengthen what remains. And again, Sardis had been taken, been captured, because they'd all fallen asleep and they hadn't posted a guard. And those who were besieging the city, they saw there was a back door and they went in and they took them by surprise. So here John, the risen Jesus, is using language and imagery which is really vivid to them and communicated to them and said something very particular about what the gospel meant in their own situation.